Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Not sure what time of day it is that you're taking a look at this, but I thought I'd put together this presentation to try and make a connection between the readings we've had so far, as well as the John Hattie videos. And I would expect, having read that article, as well as listening to some of those videos, that you might be saying, okay, Sean, I think I'm getting a handle on evidence-based practices. I do believe that evidence-based practices are critical, especially for this idea of multi-tiered systems of support. But making the connections, I'm having a little difficulty. Well, I thought I'd try adding this element on and kind of combining those components would be hopefully a little bit closer to understanding what the cornerstone of multi-tiered systems of support, and to me, the cornerstone of what we should be doing as instructors, and that is utilizing and intervening with and implementing evidence-based practices. And you may be looking at that visual there saying, just facts? Well, yeah, let's just focus on the facts here from this old, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the television show that definitely predates me. Anyways, let's start off with the definition. And I'm going to stay on this slide for a moment or two here, because I think this is really critical for us to understand those four primary elements of evidence-based practices. First of all, it needs to, the practice itself, and it's not an intervention, not just instructional. It could be behavioral, could be social emotional. It shows a positive effect on student outcomes. So it could show the fact that an individual is able to pay more attention, more organized, more structured. It could be something in terms of reading and learning and things of that nature. The second thing that's really critical and oftentimes difficult for us as practitioners is a research design. And yet we do know that the research design is critical in that the questions asked, the methods used to collect data on the intervention and determine whether or not it actually has a positive outcome or showed student improvement is critical. The design needs to match the question and the like. Now, again, that may not be something that we are capable of. That's where we need to allow other entities and peer-reviewed articles and things of that nature to make the connection. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. Next, it needs to be not just one great study, but a number of high-quality studies that show the positive outcomes, that have the research design that's appropriate. And finally, it needs to be reviewed by a reputable organization. We'll talk about the What Works Clearinghouse, but also, to me, it's a reputable process. It's peer-reviewed, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment as well. It's all very, very critical to what an evidence-based practice is. And again, essential element for MTSS. Now, before we leave this slide, take a look at that visual up to the top. And maybe you've been looking at that going, well, Sean, that's not education. That's more health and sciences and the like. Exactly. Evidence-based practice literature and research is really a phenomenon of the 1900s, well through the 20th century in the sciences. I mean, think of all the FDA studies and the like. Well, the sciences were arguing there as we came into the 21st century that education isn't using evidence-based practices. They're using practices that they're willy-nilly about. And so with the passage of No Child Left Behind in 2001, this idea that, well, we need to be using and understanding evidence-based practices, which makes a lot of sense. One of the challenges, though, is the clinical trials and things that are being done in the sciences isn't necessarily ethical and appropriate for something that we would try to do in the classroom. Like, for example, withholding an intervention to a group of individuals when you know it does work or has some promise, and you ignore it to a group of individuals that could benefit from it. That's a bit unethical when it comes to education. So anyways, let's think about then in terms of that 3 and 4 element what I just mentioned, and that's journal articles. And if you're like some of my students and some of my graduate students, journal articles, Sean, oh, come on, they're hard to understand. The research design, oh, the methodology, I don't understand it. It's too difficult. And I appreciate that. Truly, it's one of the reasons we're having difficulty between taking research into practice. I bring it up not so much that my expectation is you're going to become a regular connoisseur of research articles. I do not have that expectation. But I think we need to appreciate the fact that the research articles that appear in journals are different from a paper that someone presents at a local, regional, state, national conference, as well as different from a white paper or monograph or something that's posted on the website. And I say that because from a journal perspective, first of all, we have an editor that's been through a variety of review processes to determine that they actually have the skills to determine whether or not something's effective. Secondly, when a paper is submitted for review, it just isn't one person that reviews it. There's 3 professionals that review it. And these professionals aren't just selected off the street. These professionals are selected based on their background, based on their resume, based on what's called a vita. And then they review it based on the obligations and the parameters of the publication, and they determine whether or not it's appropriate. And even there's edits and re-edits and decisions. It's an extensive process, 6 to 7 to potentially 12 months. It's one of the challenges with getting up-to-date literature and research is because it takes time to get reviewed. But that review offers it more credibility. That review determines it's actually met some parameters. That review aligns to the fact that the student outcomes measured actually align to the measurement itself. So that's a critical element. It's a critical element in terms of the peer review component and the element of what's effective in evidence-based practices. Now, you may be asking at this point, and you've maybe been asking since I've started this, is the why, Sean? Why do we need to be selecting evidence-based? Come on, there's a lot of good interventions out there. Why do we need to make sure that they're evidence-based? Well, let's kind of break that down. Let's do some math. And to me, one reason for the why is the fact that, my goodness, I want to make sure for all the children I work with, and for my own children, and for my son Nolan, who's that 11th grader with Down syndrome, I want to make sure that we're using a practice that's effective and efficient. Now, effective, Sean? Okay, but efficient? Well, let's do the math on the days. So we're out here about 172 school days. And when I say 172 school days, that's the total. Then I start doing some math. I'm going to take a few away from the beginning of the school year. Beginning of school year, critical days. But you know what? There's a lot of transition going on. There's a lot of movement in classes. There's a lot of just getting welcome. And we're not jumping right in day one. So I'm going to take a day or two there, all right? Halloween, my goodness. Halloween, great day at the elementary level. I'd argue there's really not a lot going on. Maybe some social emotional development, but in terms of, we try. In terms of the overall interventions, I think that's difficult. Then we take a day or two around Thanksgiving, not necessarily the holiday we take, but rather in preparation for, or where the students' minds are, their rowdiness, or whatever it may be. Then you think the end of the quarter or the end of the trimester. And I don't know how many times I've seen it, myself included, where we're trying to finish something. We've finished it and we really want to start for the next one, but there's going to be a little break or we need to transition or whatever it may be. And there's a day or two lost there. And then around the breaks, either before the holiday where we're transitioning, the students just aren't with us, or after the holiday when we're trying to bring things back up, throw in a snow day or two or ice day or two, which is relevant right now. Then, of course, the same in terms of spring break and Easter break. And then, of course, at the end of the year, I'd argue some of those last days there, there's not necessarily a lot of meaningful instruction going on. There's some good instruction going on, but in terms of that overall impact or something to compare to another very effective instructional day, I'd have to say not so much. Now, again, there's lots of different reasons for that, but to me, it reinforces the fact that, wait a minute, that 172 just went down to 160, let's say. So I want to make sure what I use intervention-wise is effective and very efficient to get to the effectiveness as soon as possible. Now, another reason why, to me, is to consider that kind of down-the-hall mentality. And yes, this isn't a school, but I thought that was kind of cute. But the idea, and maybe it's because I have a freshman daughter in a dorm, and I'm thinking more dorm rooms now, but anyways, this idea that, well, you know what, I need a practice, I need something as an intervention, I'm just going to go down the hall and ask one of my peers. And that might be perfect, but the problem is what my peer may say is evidence-based. First of all, it may align, but it may not be to the population I'm working with. This may be great for third graders, but not great for third graders tier 3, or third graders with learning disabilities. Or this might be great for typically developing, but not for a kid with an intellectual disability or Down syndrome. So that's one of the considerations. Take it down the hall a little bit further and take it down the hall to a presentation I went to, a workshop maybe, or maybe it's a regional workshop, or maybe it was even a national workshop, so way down the hall. But the reality is someone says, oh, this works. Oh, is there evidence behind it? Well, we have a study, and this study is a small sample, or this study, it doesn't really relate to the study of participants or individuals that you work with. Those are the things you need to consider, because I don't know how many times I've seen teachers say, well, I'm trying this approach because so-and-so, or I saw this, and then they're scratching their head X number of days or X number of weeks down the way to say, why isn't it working? Well, it's not working because there wasn't evidence to begin with in your population or for your purposes, or the list goes on. All right. Another reason why, yes, does involve Jenny McCarthy and, oh, what is his name? Oh my goodness, Jim Carrey. So why are they here? And evidence-based and the like, and why the evidence-based? Well, some of you may already be there and say, Jenny McCarthy, vaccinations and autism. Now, some of you may be saying, wait a minute, Jenny McCarthy, Catholic schools, she went to Mother and Macaulay Liberal Arts High School, and she's from a nice Catholic family, and she is all that. But Wikipedia also tells us that Jenny McCarthy wore her Mother Macaulay Liberal Arts High School sweater when she appeared in Playboy. We won't get into that. Anyways, that's not why I put her up there. I put her up there because of vaccinations and autism. See, back about 5 to 10 years ago, Jenny McCarthy, she has a son who's now, I think, in his 20s, and he was born with autism, according to what, not born with autism, she feels he was born, and he developed autism due to vaccinations that he received about 18 months to 2 years of his life. And she wrote a book about it, national bestseller. She got on all sorts of different news items, news organizations, CNN and others. She argued and debated doctors from the Center for Disease Control. She held movements at Washington, D.C. with her celebrity husband, Jim Carrey, all to stop vaccinations, all to change vaccinations because she felt it directly caused autism in her son. Well, the science shows that's not true. The science upon science shows it's not true. The article, the one study that makes a connection between this and a man who then went off and presented on this for the better part of a decade was actually shown, it was retracted earlier this century by the British journal that actually published it, which is very, very unheard of, but because it was so wrong in respect to the results. But yet, those types of activities, those types of ideas that were generated led to outbreaks of measles at Disneyland. Yes, Jenny McCarthy can be blamed for the measles at Disneyland. Well, I'm not sure she can be directly blamed, but the idea is people restricted their use of vaccinations. And we have targeted populations throughout the country. You'll see targeted areas where clearly folks have restricted or not vaccinated their children for diseases that we thought we not only had under control, that they were gone, and clearly they're not. And so that becomes a major problem. That shut down Disneyland, for example, but it's also shut down schools. It also causes outbreaks of disease we thought we had under control that is having a long-term impact on those children, sadly, and their families. All due to this idea that, well, vaccinations cause autism. Well, there's no evidence behind that. So let's look at the evidence and let's try to grow the evidence. And that to me is a really strong reason on the why, not so much autism vaccination, but why we need to be looking at evidence-based practices for our tier-based supports and MTSS and the like that we use our students to make sure they're effective and make sure they're efficient and make sure that we're supporting the individuals the way we need to. Now I'm going to take a break here and we're going to move into some other elements of evidence-based practices and interventions here in just a moment. But I wanted to kind of give us a break here to kind of think about this a little bit, and then we'll move on into some practical applications as well.